Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. It's really exciting to have the opportunity to talk to the National Infrastructure Commission today about their recent resilience study. And we're joined by Eleanor Voss, who's a policy advisor to the Infrastructure Commission. Eleanor, would you mind just giving us a little bit of background on who you are and what your role is at the Infrastructure Commission?
Absolutely, and thank you, Sam, very much for inviting me along. It's great to be talking with you. So my background is in engineering, but now in a policy role, my focus is on both resilience and data. So I'm very pleased to be talking with you and the DT Hub.
Brilliant. So my understanding is that the Infrastructure Commission's actually been involved with the National Digital Twin Programme for quite some time. Would you be able to provide us a bit of background on where that relationship came from and what the role is with the Infrastructure Commission?
Absolutely. So to give you a bit of background on the Commission itself, the Commission is an executive agency of the Treasury, and the Commission's role is to make independent recommendations to government on economic infrastructure policy. If government accepts the Commission's recommendations, they become government policy. And a great example of this dates back to 2017, when the NIC published its report, Data for the Public Good. This made recommendations to government on the opportunities that data and machine learning and AI and digital twins present for infrastructure planning, operation and resilience. Now, of course, following the government's acceptance of those recommendations, the Centre for Digital Built Britain is taking forward much of this work through its Digital Twin programme. And the Commission is really pleased to continue to play a role in steering this valuable programme.
So that sounds like a pretty kind of revolutionary piece of work, and one that sounds like it's kind of really pushing the UK agenda forward. I understand today we're kind of focusing on this more recent piece of work around resilience, which I guess we all hear about resilience in one guise or another. But could you give us a bit of an idea as what's prompted the Infrastructure Commission's interest in resilience?
Absolutely. So resilience is a key part of infrastructure planning, and the Commission has previously looked at resilience at a sector level in both water and energy, but this is the first study to truly look cross-sectorally. So the current environmental, population and technological changes makes resilience a pressing issue now, and in fact is compounded by the interdependent nature of our infrastructure, which means a cross-sector perspective is incredibly important. For example, our telecommunications and our transport networks depend heavily on electricity supply. And as technology develops, this cross-sector dependence may become even more tightly coupled. So in 2018, the then Chancellor asked the Commission to undertake a cross-sector study to recommend to government what policy measures would need to be put in place to ensure the resilience of four sectors: energy, telecommunications, water and the transport sectors. And a few weeks ago, we're pleased that the Commission published the report that is a result of this study, titled Anticipate, React and Recover. So this report calls for government to set standards for the resilience of our infrastructure. It calls on government to create a framework to ensure that these standards can be met now and in the future. Obviously, the world is a very different place to when the report was first commissioned, and COVID-19 means that resilience is being talked about by absolutely everyone. But during the current crisis, in fact, our infrastructure systems have generally stood up incredibly well. This is thanks to the hard work of infrastructure operators, and through this hard work, we've been able to all access the water, energy, transport and communications as we need them, despite the unprecedented circumstances. But there's a question remaining. What if the threat had been different? Or what if two or more unexpected events had occurred at the same time? As a society, we need to have confidence that our services will support us across a range of circumstances. Knowing after the fact is too late. So the NIC's report sets out a pathway to achieving this confidence in our resilient infrastructure systems.
I mean, yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And I guess for most people, they would assume the UK is a relatively resilient country with its infrastructure. If we look back 30, 40 years, the UK was a different place. We used to have rolling blackouts and all of that sort of thing, and we don't really get that sort of thing anymore. But I guess resilience itself is quite a complex topic. It means different things to different people. What sort of interpretation did the Infrastructure Commission take for this?
That's a great question and a really, really interesting one. In fact, what we found is that resilience is understood differently by different disciplines and sectors, and that's probably no bad thing. But there is real value in having a high-level common understanding, because this allows us to collaborate, to share knowledge, to share information, and do better together. So the NIC researched and we consulted and we engaged, we talked to lots of people throughout the study to understand these different perspectives. And through this work, we were able to develop a framework for how to think about resilience. And I wouldn't say that it's a definition. I think that's too kind of harsh a tone, but it's more about providing people with a common way to talk about resilience at a high level. So the framework gives an indication of what infrastructure systems, and by that I mean both the engineering and the organizational systems, what they should be able to do to be resilient. So the framework suggests they should be able to anticipate. That's about looking ahead. It's about preparing. They should be able to resist. That's preventing damage. Absorb. So that's providing services even if they are damaged. Recover, about repairing, getting up and running again. Adapting, which is about modifying to accommodate variation in environment and use. And to transform, which is to accommodate even more significant change. So how systems do all of these things will be different for every system, but the framework can be used to ensure the best outcomes possible are achieved should a shock occur and help us all to talk about resilience together.
I mean, that must have been quite an interesting process to go through, and I'd imagine quite enlightening. I suspect organisations that you spoke to hadn't had to look at this in such a degree of detail in quite some time. So after you kind of gone through that process, what were the kind of key conclusions or the key recommendations that you made to government?
So pulling all of that together and assessing the kind of policy, legislative, regulatory landscape that infrastructure functions within, the report called for government to set these standards for resilience. And to create a framework to ensure that those standards will be met now and in the future. And these are standards that would set out the levels of resilience that government expects under different circumstances. And that fits into the anticipate part of resilience, making sure that we know what we want to achieve. But the report emphasises the huge role that infrastructure operators play in this process, and they know their systems better than government can. And they're best placed to evaluate whether their systems will be able to meet these standards and provide services to the public despite the shocks and stresses that might occur. So the Commission's report calls for operators to regularly stress test their systems to give confidence that they are resilient now, but also to maintain long-term strategies to give confidence that the systems will be resilient in the future. So there are two components to creating that confidence that we will be able to cope with stresses and shocks in the future. However, the report also recognises and emphasises the key role that regulators play in all of this. Regulators would create the obligations for operators to do the stress testing and to develop the long-term strategies, but also they will provide the guidance, support, and knowledge sharing that helps operators do them well. So those are the recommendations that the Commission has set out for government. And as I say, the Commission's role is that should government accept those recommendations, they become government policy.
I mean, that's quite a significant undertaking, I guess. And I mean, as you know, we're focused on digital twins within our programme, within the Digital Twin Hub. And it seems to me that there's quite a high degree of parity between what we're trying to do in terms of making data more available, more accessible, and giving us a greater understanding of infrastructure and some of the key aims of what you're trying to achieve. we're currently focusing on how digital twins can support the organisations themselves, but I guess it's not impossible to imagine that perhaps the regulators themselves may also need to interface with these digital twins in the future. What are your kind of thoughts about how digital twins can support resilience activities?
So absolutely, this is a significant piece of work, and it's a significant thing to ask people to do. But there's already really good work being done in this area, and so this isn't by any means starting from scratch. Many operators do good work and to understand their resilience, and many sectors have established processes. So this is about building on that good practice and that good work. And digital twins absolutely provide a tool in the toolbox to help us do it even better. And they're potentially a really valuable tool, I think. They could be particularly valuable for operators as they stress test their systems, as they understand their own resilience, as they identify vulnerabilities. But you're right, the Commission's report emphasises that link back to regulators, and that comes from regulators setting out those obligations for operators to do the stress testing, but also for regulators to oversee the tests, to provide guidance on scenarios, frequency, scope, and also guidance on the content of confidential and public reporting outcomes. So there will inevitably need to be a conversation between those two types of organisations. There's an interesting question that you raise about whether regulators might need to be interacting with the digital twins in any way themselves. And I think it's an open one, and I think each sector will find its own solution. Certainly, digital twins can provide a communication method they are there in part to support information sharing, and they could do this between different types of organisations, although it's not essential for carrying out the NIC's recommendation. Nonetheless, we hope that industry doesn't hold back from finding creative, innovative solutions to these problems and working together in a really effective way. Clearly, digital twins provide a really useful tool for that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, it's probably worth just reflecting on the fact that one of the objectives of the National Digital Twin Programme is to create this information management framework. One of the outcomes of that is it should allow us to do kind of those cross-sectoral views across digital twins, and it may be worth kind of considering as part of that, I guess, how regulators might be able to feed into that. I mean, moving on very slightly, in the report you've kind of set, I guess, estimate or approximate timescales of getting to a point where we can have these capabilities in place by 2023. We're kind of just at the start of this roadmap in terms of developing digital twins. So from my point of view, that seems quite optimistic or quite challenging, depending on how you want to look at it. I suspect a lot of our listeners will be interested to know what could they be doing now to try and put themselves in a good position. I mean, you said that we're not starting from scratch, which is a good thing and reassuring for everyone to hear. But it'd be good to get a sense of what we can be doing now and how can we make sure those timeframes are achievable.
No, of course. So the report did set out a series of recommended milestones. So, for example, the report calls for government to set the resilience standards, these expectations for how infrastructure should perform, and to do that by 2022. And then for regulators to introduce the obligations for the infrastructure operators to undertake the stress testing by 2023, with the intention that the first round of stress tests should be complete by 2024. Clearly, digital twins can be incredibly useful to make this happen, and I think we'd like to see a kind of link between the two. But I expect the development of both will happen in parallel to some extent. And as I say, digital twins are one tool in the toolbox, but potentially a really valuable one. So those milestones were set out kind of in recognition that action is needed to make sure we're ready for the next shock for when the next shock arrives. And I think you're right to think about what are the steps that organisations can take now. And I think there are three that could be really useful. The first is to continue operators' work in ensuring that they understand their systems. Are they collecting the right data? Are they storing it? Are they making it available and accessible to the right people in the right way, securely and appropriately? Secondly, to ensure that the right questions are being asked when assessing the resilience of systems, and that the right tools are in place to use that data that's been collected, stored, shared to answer those questions. In fact, alongside the study, the NIC has published a couple of pieces of work that might be interesting to people thinking about this. We undertook some work with the ITRC that piloted an analysis approach. And then we also worked with Bristol University and UCL to explore analysis methods. And those resources are up on our website, and I welcome people to check them out. And thirdly, finally, I think that what's particularly important is that organisations continue and step up learning from each other, sharing knowledge and collaborating where appropriate to develop approaches to interrogating the resilience of infrastructure systems. Clearly, and I'm really pleased about this, the DT Hub provides a really valuable forum to do all of this. And the wider work of the National Digital Twin Programme, particularly you mentioned the IMF, is essential to supporting these steps.
And I guess just for our listeners, if anyone's not familiar with the ITRC, that's the Infrastructure Transmissions Research Consortium based at the University of Oxford. And they're pushing a lot of the work in this space and are very much at the forefront of that. I imagine, Eleanor, that we're not going to be doing actual stress tests. These are predominantly going to be simulated stress tests for us to understand. And I guess the better the stress test is going to rely on the better the model that we're able to simulate that on. We are trying to explore, as part of the programme, the creation of standards for digital twins. And you've written in the paper that you're trying to explore standards for resilience. It strikes me as perhaps an opportunity to make sure those two things are aligned, such that digital twins may be created in a manner that is conducive to doing simulations for resilience. What are your kind of thoughts on that?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think you're right that there's potentially an importance in kind of understanding the connection between them. So the standards called for in the Commission's report set out the expectations of our infrastructure, how we would like it to perform under different circumstances. And this would allow people to prepare appropriately for disruptions and failures, and for operators to know what's expected of them. The National Digital Twins work towards digital twin standards is equally important, but it is different. They are looking towards how to support information sharing. But I think appreciation of those resilience standards in the National Digital Twins programme's work could be extremely valuable. Should government accept and act on the NIC's recommendations, the resilience standards would inform infrastructure operators in a way about what they will be measured against. And good data sharing standards will need to take account of what the data will be used to measure. So data could usefully be structured and shared in a way that supports operators in assessing whether they can meet the government's resilience standards. So I think an awareness is going to be really important, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess data really is going to become a core component in this. I think recommendation in the report, the second recommendation in the report was regulators should require a system of regular stress tests by 2024 for the core sectors you've already mentioned, to ensure that infrastructure operators' systems and decision making can credibly meet resilience standards for infrastructure services. That's a challenging question in itself, and we've spoken about the important role that data is going to play in that. Obviously, there's data, and there's data of different quality, data of different granularity. Is that part of the role of the standards to define that granularity, the quality requirements, or is that a separate activity unto itself?
So it's Not part of the resilience standards that come out of the recommendation in the report, but I think that it is particularly relevant to the questions that that the CDBB are tackling now in how to use digital twins to understand our infrastructure. So throughout the report, the Commission has anticipated a need to source expertise widely to inform these sorts of questions about choosing the right level of granularity, for example, and how to model effectively. And in fact, throughout the report emphasizes knowledge sharing. So I think the question that you raise is a really interesting one to pose to the membership of the Digital Twin Hub. Digital twins are potentially a very valuable tool for assessing resilience. But to use the digital twins well, we do need data standards in place to enable that information sharing at the right level of granularity and that information use at the right level of granularity. And I think it'll be important to establish an approach to deciding the right granularity. That's because I suspect that the right level will not be the same for everyone, for every sector, for every system. And so having this conversation is incredibly important. Finding a way to make the decision is incredibly important. And in fact, this is an ideal community, I think, the Digital Twin Hub membership, to progress the conversation. An important thing to recognise is that the Commission asked regulators to ensure that the stress testing is proportionate. Increasing granularity creates additional work. So finding the right level for the right system, for the right sector is going to be an important question to get right.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the concepts we've tried to distill into our community, which is that a digital twin doesn't have to be high definition per se to have any value. And I guess that kind of the same thing kind of is relevant here, that we might be able to look at it at quite a coarse level and still get quite good levels of value out of it. And then in time, we might be able to increase that, but we make sure we increase it in a proportionate and secure and sensible manner. I guess the UK itself at the moment is in a very unexpected situation with COVID-19, which has made us change our kind of mode of operation in a manner that no one really had anticipated. And I guess it's interesting to think that what if scenarios might be a mechanism we could use to explore them. But I guess you've always got that challenge of how extreme do you go when you're considering extreme events. Is that one of the kind of considerations of the report, of extreme events in themselves, not just in terms of unexpected demands on energy, but kind of really unexpected things on a kind of wider front as well?
Yes, absolutely. We were really keen throughout the report to be able to tackle the question of those really big unknowns and make sure that a governance framework is in place to help us all have confidence that we will be able to cope in those sorts of situations. And part of the way that the recommendations tackle this question is to ask that the stress testing would take two different forms. One is to look at what if scenarios, and these can be used to tell us what might happen if a specific event takes place. And so that's a really important tool to say, if this happens, then what happens to the rest of the system? But it's important to approach it from the other direction as well. And this might be called, for example, reverse stress testing, where you look at what it would take for the system to break, what it would take to cause a loss of service. So you don't impose the event on the system. You look at what it would take to cause damage to the system. And this type of stress testing, this reverse stress testing, can reveal vulnerabilities in the system that might be hidden if we didn't ask the right what if question, if we didn't pose the right scenario. So this is an important part of being able to have confidence that we can cope with extreme events, knowing that we've looked at the system from two different directions. So the report calls on government and regulators to require that operators do both of these types of tests. and that the tests therefore can be used to rigorously demonstrate that systems can stand up to these extreme events, or reliably identify the weaknesses so that people can address them in time. Some operators actually already do this, and that's great. And the report calls on regulators to promote sharing of best practice. There's really good work out there already, and we should build on it. Again, I think this is a really interesting question to ask the membership of the DT Hub to think about. How can digital twins be used by operators to analyse what-if scenarios, and how can they be used to investigate what would cause a loss of service? As I say, digital twins are one potential tool in the toolbox, but one with a lot of potential. What do they need to be developed and then used to support this, alongside sharing the information that's generated safely and securely?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's worth just mentioning to our listeners again that when we start to look at kind of network weaknesses and stuff, government does actually have specific bodies in place to support with kind of managing that sort of thing in a kind of safe and secure manner. That's right, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. Clearly, asking these questions can lead us to identify concerning vulnerabilities in the systems, and the right organisations in government need to be brought into the right conversations. And what's also incredibly important, and the National Digital Twin Programme are playing a really important role in this, is that the information sharing systems need to be set up safely and securely so that only the right people know this information at the right time, and it isn't shared in a way that could potentially be damaging.
Yeah, no, thanks for clarifying that. I mean, I could ask you questions about this all day, but in the interest of time, we should probably look at starting to provide some sort of conclusions. As is always good in an interview, I save the hardest question until last to make the eagle work. But resilience is obviously complicated in itself because systems aren't self-contained, and UK's infrastructure isn't self-contained. Everything has dependencies and other things, and there's interdependencies through things. How do we even think about managing that and exploring that in the sense of resilience as well?
So this is a fascinating question, and really gets to the heart of our modern society, I think. Dependencies and interdependencies can have a really large impact on the resilience of infrastructure. An example of this was actually relatively recently. In August last year, there was a power outage, and many of us experienced the impact this had on the trains. So even in just that one day, we saw how tightly coupled the two systems are and how much the trains were depending on their electricity supply. And understanding that dependency is incredibly important. So this is another side of making sure that the right people know the right information about the performance and the resilience of different parts of the system. It's a really key part of understanding our resilience overall. And not everyone needs to know everything, but the right people do need to know the right things. So the Commission's report absolutely took this into account and called for regulators to ask operators to consider dependencies when stress testing their systems. And appropriate data sharing and digital twins could definitely support this. I think it's a great third question for the membership of the DT Hub. How can digital twins be used to understand the impact on resilience of dependencies and interdependencies? How can they be used to share the right information with the right people in the right way? And how can they be used to ask the right questions? No,
thanks. And I guess it's it's worth just mentioning to the listeners again that part of the reason we're having this call with Eleanor today is because we're going to be having some discussions within the hub that people can get involved in and really start to provide some evidence and feedback to the work that the Infrastructure Commission has done so far. I mean, yeah, thanks Eleanor for kind of taking the time to speak to us today. Is there any sort of closing points you'd like to make to the community? Any specific asks you want to kind of just reiterate? I'd just be keen to hear.
So we're really excited that that you are going to ask for a discussion in the DT Hub. I think that it's a great way to start to unpick some of these really challenging questions. And in fact, talking with you today, Sam, we've pulled out 3 really interesting questions that the membership may like to explore. We've talked a bit about choosing the right level of granularity in the data and the modelling. We've talked about understanding how to use digital twins for what-if scenario testing, but also to understand what it takes to cause a loss of service. So looking at it from both directions. And finally, this big question of dependencies and interdependencies. How can digital twins be used as a tool to help us understand this and to help us manage those dependencies well? So we're really excited. The Commission is really excited that the membership might be talking about these questions, and looking forward to seeing where the discussion leads. We absolutely depend on the kinds of expertise that's in the membership and really value that.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, thanks ever so much for taking the time to speak to us today. It's been absolutely fascinating. I feel like I've got a better understanding of what the objectives are of this piece of work, what it is you're really looking for in terms of resilience. And I really look forward to hearing from the community and seeing what their feedback is. So thanks again, and thanks for the community, and we look forward to providing updates to you in the future.
Well, thank you.